Time to begin the interview. Today I have Dale Meade with me up here, familiar to most of us, but hopefully I'll be able to draw something out that you've never heard before from Dale. We'll see how that goes. So Dale, I know you've been over 40 years in the mission field. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like going to the mission field? I think you went straight out of college, correct, from Cincinnati Bible College?
Yes, we started out, as we finished, I'd had all these classes in missions back then, which was missionary methods and life and work and all that kind of stuff, but none of them told you how to raise support. So I thought, well, it's simple, you just write a letter and you get the support and go. So we wrote letters and sent them to like 100 churches, and we thought, well, that's going to take care of it. And after 100 churches, we didn't even get a single response back. But we were determined to go, and little by little, my home church picked me up, and Jeannie's did, and we had about $200 in support. We wrote off the language school and said, we'll be there, and unbeknownst to us, they sent back a letter and said, that's not enough support, we will not accept you. Since we didn't have money for a plane ticket, we drove in an old car somebody had donated to us, and it was going to take a month to get there, and when the letter arrived saying that you weren't accepted, we were already probably in northern Mexico somewhere. So we got, after 23 days, we made it to Costa Rica, showed up to the language school and said, here, we're here to study, and they looked at their books and they said, we don't have anybody by your name registered for class. So there we were down in Costa Rica and supposedly nothing, and they said, well, tell you what, we'll let you stay on probation, but we don't want you running up bills and making a bad name for the gospel and for us. Okay, we'll do it. And we just prayed, Lord, provide, and he did, and we stayed through language school, finished that, then got into Colombia, and very quickly moved way out into the jungle where we're going to be living and working, and set up. It was a period of time of about 14 months from the time we left, or 14, 15 months until we arrived in the jungle, giving about 11 months for language school. And then we were out in the jungle and set up a house and began to work.
Well, you say set up a house because I just wonder what the progression was here. You know, 10, 15 years ago when you were here, you were camping in a tent. Now you've moved up to a camper. So if I go back, I'm just wondering what you lived in Colombia in the jungles. Were you there in a tent? Were you Tarzan up in the trees, or how did this work?
Okay, when we got out there, of course, by then we had our first child. We knew we were going to be out in the jungle, so I always say that we started that manufacturing process in Costa Rica, and where we had medical facilities. Got out into the jungle, and we got what was a very nice house for out in that region. It was an 18-foot by 18-foot cement block house, cement floors, cement asbestos sheet roofing, and that was it. And you know, we had water that would come one day every week, and it'd fill up like a laundry tank, and Jeannie would have to dip it out of the laundry tank, and that way it was the way we could wash clothes and get showers and everything. Then I would take off and go out into the jungle, and there I would sleep in a hammock between two trees. Didn't even have a tent out there as I walked and preached. And Jeannie would stay home and take care of the house and the child and be waiting for me when I came back. We had to have all the furniture made. There was no furniture stores where you could buy anything. Our daughter Wendy slept for her first 2 or 3 months in a suitcase. We had opened the lid, spread a mosquito net over it, and that was it until we could get somebody to make a crib for her. And then we, little by little, I managed to get, we'd taken a folding card table with us, and that was where we ate our lunch, Coleman camp stove, and that's what Jeannie cooked on, that type of thing. We eventually got one of those little washing machines that has a spinner beside it, and the washer thing over here, one of those little apartment things. Up until then, Jeannie washed by hand on a laundry tank. And so it was very, very primitive, very, very backward. We had a kerosene lamp for our light. Didn't have any refrigeration in the beginning. Eventually got a kerosene refrigerator, one that burned kerosene, not electricity. Cooled, but didn't get stuff cold. But hey, out when it's 100 degrees, cool is better than hot. And that's how we started out. And I would walk about usually 8 to 10 days out a jungle trail, and wherever I would stop at night, I'd string up my hammock and sleep in the jungle. Then I would walk and find a smoke coming up, and I'd say there's a house there, and I'd find the trail and get back and share the gospel with them. And then after going out for 6, 8, 10 days, then I'd cross over to another trail and come back in and spend a few days at home with Jeannie, and I'd be off and do it again.
So did they give you maps to find these trails, or it was just like hit and miss?
It was hit and miss. I'd ask the local people. It was a little, what had been an Indian village. There was still some of the Indian population there, and then as the Colombian government was homesteading this area, they would take a bulldozer and cut a trail out into the jungle. Then they would give away land on either side, much like the homesteading here in America. And so from the town, it was kind of like the spokes of a wheel, and you could take one of these trails out, and I would simply start walking on one of those till the trail petered out. There was no more trail. And then often there'd be like a trace, a very small, indistinct path that would cut over to another trail. Then you could come back in on that other trail. And so some of it was hit and miss, but often I'd ask them, well, there's a trail, and they'd say, yeah, you go, there's a creek and this great big old tree on the right or something. If you look carefully off to the left side, you'll see where a trail cuts off, and so I would do that. And that's how I found my way. No maps, no GPS, the Lord being with me, and willingness to simply try it.
And having your machete with you so you could cut the head off the snake and eat the heart right there. Isn't that what they do in the jungle?
Well, I always did carry a machete. That was required out in the jungle. I started out wearing hiking boots, by the way, because that's what Americans did when we went hiking. But I found out hiking boots in the tropical rainforest don't work very well. You're in mud and water up to your ankles or knees most of the time, and leather boots rot quick, and if you have your feet and leather boots that are rotting, your feet start doing the same. So I got rid of those, and I started wearing just sandals like the Colombians would wear, made out of old car tires with some nylon webbing across them. And then I would hike that way. As I was in the jungle, I didn't cut the heads off snakes because I like snakes. I would catch them off and look at them and kind of study them, figure out if they were poisonous or not. And all. I would usually wait until I found a place, and then as I'd walk in, Colombians were very hospitable. And so no matter what time of day or night you showed up, they said, we're just getting ready to sit down to eat. And you'd say, okay, they'd invite you to eat and sit down to eat and all, but then the kids would be running around chasing a chicken and grabbing it and ripping its feathers off. And so that just sitting down to eat was 2 or 3 hours later. But that gave me time to sit there and share the gospel with them as we'd sit on a log and talk. What are you doing here? Well, I'm out here with good news. And, oh, what's that? And I'd pull my Bible out, carry it in my backpack. As I'd pull my Bible out, they'd look and they'd go, wow, that's one of those prohibited books, because in Colombia it had been illegal to import the Bibles through the 50s and into the 60s. In 1964, with the Second Vatican Council, that changed somewhat. But even up into the early 70s, it was very difficult to find a Bible in Colombia. And so when I'd pull the Bible out, they'd say, wow, that's one of those prohibited books. What's so terrible in it that we're not allowed to read it? And I'd say, well, I don't know. I don't see too much terrible in it. Pretty good stuff, actually. And so I would usually open it up and I'd read. I like to go to John 1 because of the message. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things were made by Him, and without Him, nothing was made that was made. And in Him was life, and that life was the light of man. And they'd say, wow, that's pretty neat. Who is this light? And I'd say, it's Jesus. And they'd never heard Jesus preached, Lord and Savior. I'd never met a person out there that knew that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. No one prayed in the name of Jesus. He was a dead man on a cross, and they admired him because he was guapo. He had died, he had endured a terrible death. And that's all they knew about Jesus. And so when I started talking about a Jesus who was alive, who was creator, I'd quote Timothy, for there's one mediator between God and man, Christ Jesus the man. And they'd say, one mediator? Yeah, one. What about Mary? What about, the apostles and all that? And I said, well, I don't know about them, but the Bible says there's one. And so I would challenge their worldview or their belief system by simply quoting Bible. And they say, well, is that a Protestant Bible or a Catholic Bible? And down then I'd bought one that was a Catholic Bible, had the Apocrypha in it, but it had the seal of the Pope in the front cover where it was officially approved. And I'd open it up and I'd show them. And they'd say, well, that's not what the priest tells us. Why does he tell something else? And I said, I don't know why the priest tells you what he tells you. Go ask him. And, of course, I'd get them in trouble when they did that, which meant they were coming back and saying, oh, he just ripped me upside down, one side down the other. And now I'm all confused. And I say, well, if you're confused, God's Word has it. We couldn't get the Bible, but we had a mimeograph machine. And we typed out the New Testament on stencils, and we reprinted the New Testament on a mimeograph and passed those out. And that's how we got Bibles to people in the early days. Of course, they could carry one of those and not get in trouble because it didn't look like a Bible.
So did you run into much conflict there in the beginning as far as with the government or with the Catholic Church?
Yeah. When we first went into Colombia, you could not go in as a missionary. And so I had taken some journalism classes in college and everything simply because I did like to write. And I'd had a few articles published in Christian Standard and Straight and a few other places, and so I could show credentials as a writer. And so I was able to get a visa into Colombia as a writer, not as a missionary, and went in that way. We did experience what you would call opposition. We had been out in the jungle about 2 or 3 weeks, and there was a Catholic priest out there, and he was very much liberation theology, which is kind of Marxist philosophy with a Christian terminology or veneer over it. And he hung a big sign up across the front of the Catholic Church, and it said, "Be patriotic, kill a Yankee," an American. Well, I was the only Yankee or Gringo or American out there.
Did you feel like he was speaking of you?
I thought that might be a possibility. So I goes up to his office one day, and he's in there, and I go in and rap on the door and everything, and he opens, and we talk a little bit, and I say, hey, I'm out here, and I'm working and doing this stuff and that and all that. And I said, I'm kind of learning Spanish, so I'm not sure what it says. I says, what's that sign up there mean? And he starts mumbling and goes, well, Americans come in here and they exploit this and all that and everything else. And I say, oh, they do? I says, where? You see anyone around here is doing that? Well, no. And it says, well, if nobody's around here doing that, then why are you worried about that? I said, as far as I know, I'm the only one out here. I said, I don't think I'm exploiting anyone. I'm going out there and living with them and staying with them, and I'm helping them out, and I'm doing this, and I'm teaching them to read and all this kind of stuff. So I says, I don't think that's exploitation, is it? Oh, no, that's good if you're helping them out, that kind of stuff. All right. Well, then why do you have that up there? I said, well, we just don't like Americans too well because America does all these bad things in the world. So I sit there and I said, oh, that's interesting. I says, hey, you read? And I said, yeah, I read a lot. I says, you ever read a book by a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn? And that's when he just published the Gulag Archipelago. And so he says, well, yeah, but he just didn't like it because, he was a rich guy and they took his money away, something like that. Oh, okay. So I did stuff like that, and pretty soon we got to be friends. And he took the sign down. And he'd invite me out for a beer. He always drank beer. And I said, I don't drink beer, but I drink Coke. You'd buy me a Coke, I'll share a Coke with you. And we'd talk and we'd argue politics and stuff like that. But I found that usually the easiest way to deal with opposition or persecution was go talk to the people, ask them why they were doing it, if you had that opportunity, and let them know that you wanted a better world and you were working for that. And if that's what they were interested in, whatever their political philosophy, then maybe instead of attacking one another, maybe we could find common ground that we could work on. Well, usually they weren't willing to work to help people. They wanted to take someone else's money and do it that way, but but it made it a little bit harder. And so for the most part, I was able to mitigate the opposition. We couldn't keep windows in our church buildings. They'd come down, the Catholic priest would bring the boys from the school and stone our buildings and break windows. And we have to have, even to this day, we put like iron grates that we shut across the doors of our church buildings. And people come, we open them, let them in, and we'll shut it. Because people would come in and just take a big old rock and heave it and hit someone and that type of thing. So the opposition has waned over the years, but It was a fact of life. And in Colombia, you learn very quickly that it cost to be a Christian, but it was worth the cost. And so we had a very sharp distinction between the Christian and the non-Christian. There was no blurring, is this guy a Christian or not? You know, it was night and day. You could see it. And so the opposition actually filtered out the camp followers, the people that would just want it maybe because they could get a little bit of something out of it. We didn't have trouble with rice Christians because they were going to pay a price. And so you didn't get the opportunist. When a person made a decision, it was a genuine decision. And they knew that they would face opposition, and they were willing to do it because they felt Christ was worth it.
Then did you see that strengthened the resolve of the Christians there to continue doing what they're doing, and even reaching out into other villages or to friends and neighbors?
Yes, very much so. They had made a decision. They had paid a price. And if anything, we had trouble sometimes that we had to rein them in a little bit, because they'd want to walk right up to a neighbor and say, you know, the Pope's the Antichrist. I didn't tell them that, but they picked it up somewhere. They would say, you know, all those priests are, you know, some very negative term, homosexual, or, you know, abusers, sexual abusers, or something like that. And, you know, that doesn't help when you're trying to not antagonize people. So we would have to work and say, look, you know, maybe everything you're saying is true, but there's a way to say it in love, and that's not love. So there was a very strong commitment, and we didn't have to work to get people to go out and evangelize. That when they'd made that decision, they wanted to share that newfound faith, that sense of excitement with others. And so they're out talking to everybody. The kids would go to school. In fact, they started throwing our kids out of school because they were converting all the other kids. And so we started our Christian day schools because they wouldn't let our kids go, because our kids would go and tell all their friends at school, you know, hey, you know, what you guys believe, this idolatry, it's a bunch of baloney. You're worshiping a piece of wood or something like that. You know, what's a piece of wood going to chop it up, make your lunch with it, and then it'll do you some good that way. Well, you know, of course, that wasn't popular with the priests that were running the school, so they threw our kids out. So yes, it created a very committed, a very dynamic church that was not only willing to pay the price, but then was determined to share their faith with others. And so they were reaching out to friends, to neighbors, to family, very, very consistently. And to this day, not quite as much, but still do.
So where have you come over the years? Because, you know, you start out in the jungle, but now you're in a city. Is that where you're working out of now?
We started out in the jungle, and we were out there 4 years. We started in that 4 years, we started 4 churches and had close to 200 baptisms. We would train elders and deacons for them and then turn them over to the Colombians very, very quickly. The Colombians are very capable spiritually, as any people are. They did not need to be babysat. They had paid a price to become a Christian. They might have not had theological sophistication, but they had a very deep and a very strong faith. And so we'd work with them on doctrinal issues and things, and they were like sponges. They would just absorb it. They had so much interest. They genuinely would hunger and thirst, you know, after righteousness, after the Word of God. And we found that they memorized vast portions of the Bible very, very quickly because they just had that hunger. And so as the drug trafficking moved in, it started becoming very dangerous out there. And it was common to hear gunfights in the night and things like that. And of course, by then we had 2 small children and were concerned for their safety. So I moved my family up to Villavicencio, a small town where there was an army garrison. And then I traveled by bus or by a small plane or whatever out into the countryside to preach. And so instead of walking out the jungle trails now, I'd get on a bus and ride all day or whatever, and I'd be in this area for 3 or 4 or 5 days and come back in. In the 90s, it became very dangerous in our area as the war spread throughout Colombia. The guerrillas taglining on the drug trade, which gave them plenty of money then. And as our area fell under the control of the guerrillas, we moved for a period of time up to Bogota and kept working up there. And then I would travel back down to Villavicencio. In the 2000s, as time got better, I moved back to Villavicencio. Started working with our school there and the churches there again. I'm a country boy, I'm a hillbilly, and I do better in a small town in the country than I do in the big city. And so as we did that, I did once again when we moved out to the camp, and they said, well, help us develop this camp program. You can live out there, don't buy an apartment in town. You know, you can build yourself a little house out there, then when you're done with it, you know, if you want to donate it to the church, it would serve at the camp. I said, that sounds like a good idea. About 3 or 4 months, I lived in a tent while we built that first cabin. So I had my tent set up out there, and we're getting the walls and the roof up, and one day a windstorm came, and after 4 or 5 months, my tent was pretty well toasted in the sun, ripped open. So I moved into this small cabin I was building, no windows, no doors, just open holes in the wall, but it had a roof, and lived there until it got finished. So we've transformed the nature of our work and the location of our work based on the opportunities and the situations and the realities. We chose not to leave Colombia, even though many people recommended it, because I honestly felt that if we did not endure the time of hardship and the risk and the danger with the Colombian church, I would not have the right to speak to them in those moments of danger and of risk. And my wife and I had decided early on that we were committed enough to preach the gospel. We felt that was the most important thing in life. We felt that it was more important to do God's will than even to have a long life on this earth. And so we had made the decision that we would go, and if it would mean that one of us would lose our life in preaching the gospel, we were both willing to see that happen if that would be God's will. So we knew the risk was there, but yet I have maybe a bad habit of taking God at His word. And He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, and I will be with you even to the ends of the earth. And I said, if He said it, He meant it, and we'll do it. And so we stayed there through the worst of the war and continued to preach the gospel. And that meant a lot to the Colombian church. They said, all the other missionaries took off. You stayed. And it says, you have a right to speak to us, you know, in our times of difficulty.
How did your kids adjust through all of these different phases?
Yeah, raising kids in a situation like that is different, to say the least. My kids learned all sorts of skills. You guys don't teach your kids, you know, what is it? You know, there's a fire, you hit drop, roll, and go, or something like that, and you're supposed to do it. Well, we'd say if there's gunfire in the streets, you hit the floor, you crawl to the back of the house. My daughter's working at Casey at Cincinnati in the library, and a transformer blew up behind the building. Just boom, and everybody looks around. What's that? My daughter dropped the floor and crawled into the room, and everybody looks and says, what are you doing? She gets up sheepishly and she says, well, in my country, you know, if a bomb goes off, that's what you're supposed to do. I thought a bomb had gone off. And they all laughed at her. But it was where you taught them to live in the situation that they lived in and to protect themselves as best you can, even in a situation like that. So like we teach our kids to cross the streets. In Colombia, we would teach you, you know, you take different routes, you're aware of people around you, you don't let people get close to you without reason because of the risk. And we said, God will take care of us. And they grew up with that awareness.
Would they go with you into the villages when you take the bus out and spend a few days out?
Of my 3 children, my oldest daughter, Wendy, was the very precocious one and outgoing and all that. So from the time she was like 4 or 5 years old, 3 or 4 years old, she said, Dad, can I go with you? And I'd start taking her. My other daughter is more of an introvert, and she'd stay home with my wife and keep her company and all that. So my oldest daughter went almost everywhere, and we'd hike out, and she was a trooper. And so she went on an awful lot of trips and out into the jungle villages and all of that kind of things. She would see the monkeys in the tree and the stuff that you guys pay money to a zoo to go look at. And she'd say, oh yeah, monkeys, you know, big deal, you know, sort of a thing. So they grew up experiencing, many, many things that your typical American child doesn't experience. And while they sacrificed some things to have grown up in Colombia, they gained many things as well. And it makes a person a very versatile and adaptable person, and those are good skills to have anywhere.
Did you get her a hat and a machete too when you go out into the jungles?
Yes, actually I did. I was carrying one, so she wanted to. So you can get kind of small ones. So she never really used it for anything, but she thought it was great to carry one. So when she was little, she had a little machete that I let her carry and everything, and all that. But I carried one, and I'd cut the vines out of as you walk down the trail, the vines and branches grow, so you're just whacking away to keep the trail open. That's sort of culture down there. And I'd have my hat from the sun, but I'd put a hat on her to protect her from the sun, and other things we'd do just to, she wanted to be like Dad, so.
So what's the focus of your mission right now down in Colombia? I think you're involved in camps, you have schools. What are you doing, and how are you accomplishing it?
I think that any missionary should really be working him or herself out of a job as quickly as possible. You could do an incredible work somewhere, and if it's all based on you, the day that you're gone, the work's going to crumble. And I've actually seen that many times. A missionary winds up building his or her kingdom, not the Lord's kingdom. And when that person is taken out of the picture, often the work crumbles or even completely disappears or is taken over by some opportunist. So we have worked very, very quickly to whatever I do, I get some of the Colombian Christians doing it as quickly as possible. And yes, they make mistakes, but you made mistakes when you were learning to do whatever it was, and I did too. And if we don't let them make mistakes, they'll never do anything. So you put them to doing something, they make a mistake, say, hey, I did that too when I was getting started out, here's how you deal with that, here's what you do, that type of thing. And so as I would put them to doing a job and they would do it relatively well, I would continue to work with them and train them, but then I'd either move to a new location and do it somewhere else, or I would move to a new type of ministry. In the 90s, when the war was really hot, the Colombians themselves said, we really don't think you should be out in evangelism because you're talking to people that we don't know who they are, and they could well be guerrilla operatives. So we would request that you work more in leadership training and things of that nature, and we'll do the evangelism to avoid the risk of you being kidnapped or something like that. And so at their request, I started doing that, and they took over that aspect of the ministry. Today I work in 2 or 3 different ways. When our school reached 300 students, the government required that we have a school psychologist on staff, and we tried hiring a Colombian who was supposed to be a Christian of sorts, and not in our church, but another one. And he had been trained in Freudian psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud was the father of psychology, but he was also a good friend of a guy named Karl Marx, which means he had a very negative opinion of religion. So here we have a Christian school, and we hired this psychologist, and he's saying religion is a mental illness. That didn't work too well, so we fired him after about 2 weeks. And I had taken at Kentucky Christian University the counseling classes and my psychology requirements, and so I turned in my credentials, and I had enough to qualify, and so I started doing the work of the school psychologist. Now, even there, we had young people that I helped in difficult times in their life, and they said, hey, Dale, help me so much, I'd like to do the same. So we've had quite a few actually go into psychology as their profession, and as we've had a few graduate, I've started working with them to move them in and take over my position as well. Now, I still deal with the more complicated things like anorexia or a suicide attempt or something of that nature, simply because I've had more experience and we don't want to mess one of those up. But the more typical things, I had a big fight with my mom yesterday, what do you do there type of a thing. That I let one of these young Colombian recently graduated psychologists deal with. And so I'm moving that over to them. Then the church down there bought a church camp and adapted it, and we're working with it, but they had 48 beds. They had more than 100 people coming to church camp. So we would give the girls the beds, and the guys would just sleep on the cement floor wrapped up in a sheet. And so they said, we really need to develop these facilities more quickly. Could you help us? We don't do things for the Colombian church. We do things with the Colombian church now, and we let them take the leadership, and we partner with them. And so I said, yeah, I'll partner with you. And so we're working now to build that camp more rapidly than what they could do it on their own. Much as church camps up here, Lake James in the 20s was selling off lots and building cottages as a way to support the camp because the churches really couldn't do it yet. And so down there, they said, well, we can't do it yet, but we have this need. Can you help? And so we're partnering with them. We do have work crews coming down. Anybody like to come to Colombia on a trip? We'd love to have you. Where it was very dangerous a few years back, it's actually quite safe now, and probably no greater risk there than there would be in one of our big cities if we were to go, to Indianapolis or, South Bend or something like that. Up here, probably less than South Bend. Hope nobody's from South Bend.
So how often do you take work crews down to Colombia?
We typically run them 2 to 4 times a year now. We'll run 1 or 2 in like the February, March area, which is our dry season, and we had been running 1 or 2 in the summer, typically because teacher-type people can get off in the summer more easily. Farmers and retail people can get off in the winter. We just had a huge landslide that blocked our road, and so we're not going to schedule any rainy season work crews until we see what happens there, which means we'll be working in February and March. And then the American summer type work crews depend on how they get that landslide cleaned up. Because if the road's blocked, it's a 14 to 20 hour bus route to take a roundabout way to get back down there. So dry season, they can get it opened up. Rainy season, who knows? So those are kind of the schedules we're using.
How many people do you usually take down on a work crew?
Okay, we try to keep ours relatively small simply because of the bus and transportation and housing and all that. So we usually work with somewhere between, say, 5 and 15. And to go over 15, we have to look at it pretty carefully and make sure we're able to make the arrangements. And we work where we do an inventory skill set, and based on what those people can do and like to do, we try to tailor the project to them. We don't do adventure tourism. We had one group said, hey, we want to come down and check out the culture in Colombia and do this and that and other, and we'll pay you. And I said, I'm a missionary, I'm not a tour guide. And I know other places do that, but we don't, I'm sorry. So if you come to Colombia, we'll make you work. And you'll be a part of the work, and you'll leave a contribution that's meaningful and worthwhile. And if you're not going to do that, we won't have you down on a work crew.
Now, does your mission still work with schools and sponsor scholarships for kids?
Yeah, when we had a school in every single church for a while because of the fact that if they became Christians, they threw the kids out of school. So we had a school there. It wasn't very good, but they worked. I mean, hey, if you can add 1 + 1 is 2, you can teach a child to do the same thing. And that's almost the level we were at in some of our schools. So in 1994, when there was a new constitution written guaranteeing freedom of religion, they specifically said children could not be expelled from school based on the religious beliefs of their parents. And so that ended our kids being thrown out, and they could go to public schools. We were happy to send them back there because our kids were tearing into those places. They were out evangelizing their friends and neighbors, so we weren't worried about the schools influencing our kids. We knew our kids would be out influencing the schools for good. But the school in Villavicencio was large enough and had 100% Colombian teachers, administrators, everything else. They said, well, it's okay to keep this running. I said, sure, on one condition. If it is a ministry and if it's an evangelistic outreach, then the church can run a school. If it's just simply self-serving, then it's probably not the best use of the Lord's money. And so they kept running the school, which is why I'm working as a psychologist there now. We do have a scholarship program, and we do it very differently. That's kind of in vogue right now. But most of these child scholarship programs are actually more like money-making businesses. And many of the children you would support would be generic children. They're not real children. If you stop to think about it, is there any chance a 7-year-old kid in Colombia is going to write you a cute little letter in English and send it to you with their picture? I don't think so. We had one couple in our churches that supported a child in Colombia through one of the big name child sponsorship organizations. Can you go visit our kid? Sure. Sent me the name, the location, everything. Okay, I'll go visit them. We had a church in that section of town actually, so it was pretty easy. So I go looking and knock on the door of the address, and nobody by that name lives here. So I get an idea. I go down to the corner store. I says, do you know a kid by this name or a family by this name? He looked at him and Yes, I do. Actually, they left town about 6 or 8 years ago. I says, well, this little kid's picture. Says, oh, yeah, he's already grown up. He's been through the Army. He's off now doing something. I don't know what he's doing now. They're still sending out the picture and letters from this kid to these sponsors. So they weren't really sponsoring a child. They were sponsoring a generic child and a cute little picture and sending their money. What we do is we have scholarships in our Christian day school. And if somebody chooses, and there's a brochure on the display, to support a child, it'll be a real child. You will get a picture, and you can write them, and you can come down and visit them if you would like, and take them out and drink Coke with them, or whatever you want to do. And when they grow up and graduate, we'll tell you that. If you want to sponsor another, fine, but this kid's off on his own now. We normally provide a 1/2 scholarship because it's important that the parents sacrifice to send their kids to school. In rare cases, we'll go to 100% if the situation is a very unusual one, and maybe the child doesn't have parents that can do it. Every penny that you would send into our scholarship program goes to that child's education. We don't even take money out for the administration, the administrative cost of sending you a receipt and all that. We cover that out of our general fund. And we do that because so many of these organizations have overhead of as much as 70 to 90% of the money sent in goes into overhead. If you stop to think about that tear-jerking scene of the guy out in the slums with a cute little child, who paid for the business jet for him to fly down there? He didn't go economy class, I'll tell you that. And so because there's been so much abuse, we run ours kind of on the other extreme of that scale.
Well, we're getting close to the end of time here, so we'll wrap it up to give us a couple minutes. But I want to ask one last question before we go is, do you have any advanced education going on in Colombia, or would you send the Colombians to the U.S. or somewhere else?
Back in the late 70s, we sent a fellow up to the States. He went for a year or two to Colegio Biblico, then he took off and became an illegal immigrant making money living up in New York City. So we decided that wasn't working. Later, somebody else, an American organization, went down and sponsored a fellow, took him up. He went back to Colombia, but he said, well, I need an office, and I need a nice car, and I need fancy shoes, and if you give me that, I'll work for you, and if not, I won't work for you. So he went off and worked somewhere else because I don't wear fancy shoes, and I don't drive a nice car, and I don't have much of an office. And so he thought he needed to be treated like a big shot, and so we didn't do it. So what we've done is we've done all of our training in Colombia now, and we start out with a discipleship model called theological education by extension. And what we'll do is I'll take somebody with me, and we'll have any one of our preachers, every time you go somewhere, take a new person who's just learning with you and let them watch. And after they watch a while, then you let them participate with you. Once we get to that, then we have a formal, in every church, what we call a Bible Institute. And we have like 4 different levels, and it lasts for 2 years, 2 semesters each year. And then we train them up through our basic theology, and we'll have a theology class and then a practical class. This is the belief, this is the practice, and we do that up through a 2-year program. And then we work with correspondence type courses and take them up through a college level. And then if we get to a college level, then there are a couple of Bible colleges, interdenominational in Colombia, that we can use, but we don't send them there until we have a solid foundation in biblical doctrine, so that we don't wind up making them into something we don't want them to be. So we only use that when we get up to the graduate level.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming up here.